The flickering torchlight casts eerie shadows across the marble halls of Constantinople's great palace, where whispered conspiracies echo louder than imperial decrees. Behind these gilded walls, a courtier slips a poisoned ring into a rival's goblet, while a eunuch scribbles damning secrets onto parchment destined for the emperor's pillow. This was the Byzantine Court, a labyrinth of betrayal where smiles masked daggers, and even the throne itself balanced on a knife's edge of deception. For centuries, historians have peeled back layers of this empire's grandeur to reveal something far darker, a realm where power wasn't just won but stolen, smuggled, and sometimes smothered in silk sheets. Tonight, we venture into those shadowed corridors to uncover 30 buried scandals from the empress who ruled through a network of blind spies to the general who waged war with an army of forged letters. Every twist exposes the chilling genius of an empire that turned intrigue into an art form and survival into a blood sport. In the year 532, Constantinople trembled on the brink of chaos. What began as a riot over chariot races, blue faction against green, exploded into a full-scale rebellion against Emperor Justinian himself. The city's streets ran thick with fire and fury as mobs chanted Nika, a victory, demanding the emperor's head. For days, the rebels held the capital hostage, even crowning a rival emperor in the hippodrome. Justinian, cornered in his palace, nearly fled, but then came Theodora. The empress, once an actress scorned by the elite, stood before the trembling court and delivered a speech that changed history. "Purple makes a fine shroud," she declared, refusing to abandon the throne. Her steel resolve ignited Justinian's vengeance. The general Belisarius marched loyal troops into the hippodrome where 30,000 rebels had gathered, and not one walked out alive. The massacre didn't just crush the revolt, it sent a message written in blood: defiance would be met with annihilation. This wasn't just a riot, it was the moment the empire learned the cost of crossing Justinian and the woman who ruled beside him. The imperial bedchamber should have been the safest place in Constantinople, guarded, sacred, a fortress of silk and gold. Yet in the year 913, Emperor Alexander lay convulsing on that very bed, his body racked with agony as foam flecked his lips. Just hours earlier, he'd been feasting with his inner circle, toasting to his reign. Now his hands clawed at the sheets, his last whispered words lost to history. The court physician declared it a sudden affliction of the bowels, but the servants knew better. They'd seen the regent Zoe Carbonop's inner slipping something into the emperor's wine, a honeyed vintage laced with something far darker. Zoe had spent years scheming in the shadows, biding her time as Alexander's stepmother and co-ruler. Officially, she was there to guide him. Unofficially, she was waiting for her moment. With Alexander gone, the throne passed to his 7-year-old nephew Constantine, a boy who couldn't even lift a sword, let alone rule an empire. And who better to stand as regent than Zoe herself? What followed wasn't just a change of rulers, it was an earthquake. Generals revolted, governors declared independence, and foreign enemies smelled blood. The empire fractured under a child's unsteady hand while Zoe played puppet master from the palace. Some historians argue she acted to save the empire from Alexander's reckless wars. Others insist it was pure ambition, a dagger wrapped in maternal duty. Either way, one truth remained: in Byzantium, even a regent's kiss could be deadly. By the year 985, Emperor Basil II had ruled for nearly a decade, but behind the scenes, real power belonged to a man who could never wear the crown: Basil Lecapenus, the Grand Chamberlain. A eunuch with unmatched influence, he controlled access to the emperor, handpicked officials, and even dictated military appointments. To the court, he was the invisible hand guiding the empire. To Basil II, he was a growing threat. The breaking point came when Lecapenus secretly allied with rebellious generals, promising them wealth and titles if they helped weaken the young emperor's grip. Their plan to turn Basil into a puppet, ruling through him while draining the treasury for their own gain. But they underestimated their target. When Basil uncovered the plot, his response was swift and merciless. First, he stripped Lecapenus of his titles, replacing him with loyalists. Then, he turned his attention to the rebellious generals, thousands of them. The emperor didn't just execute his enemies, he ordered them blinded. Historians still debate the exact number, but some records claim over 15,000 men lost their sight in a single, horrifying purge. This wasn't just punishment, it was strategy. A dead rebel becomes a martyr, a blind one, a living warning. Basil ensured his enemies would never raise a sword again, while their shattered presence served as a daily reminder of imperial wrath. The message was clear: challenge the throne, and you wouldn't just lose your life, you'd lose the very light of day. Yet paradoxically, this brutal act secured Basil's legacy. With his rivals broken, he embarked on a reign of conquest, earning the name Bulgar Slayer and transforming Byzantium into a military powerhouse. The eunuch's conspiracy had sought to weaken the throne instead. It forged one of history's most fearsome emperors. The ink had barely dried on Emperor Romanos II's will when the whispers began. His sudden death in 963 left Byzantium stunned, a healthy ruler gone at 24 with no clear heir but his two young sons. Officially, the document named the boys as successors under the protection of their mother, the Dowager Empress Theodora, but the court's sharpest minds noticed something off. The phrasing was too perfect, the seals too convenient, and then there was the speed with which Theophanos' rumored lover, the brilliant General Nikephoros Phocas, was crowned co-emperor. Nikephoros was a war hero, a man who'd driven Arab invaders from Crete and Anatolia. To the public, his elevation seemed like stability, a strong hand to guide the empire while the princes grew. But behind the scenes, Theophanos' maneuvers reeked of theater. Witnesses later claimed she'd paid scribes to alter the will, inserting Nikephoros' name where it hadn't been before. Others swore she'd poisoned Romanos to clear the path. Regardless, the result was undeniable. Within months, Theophano went from grieving widow to the power behind two thrones. Yet her ambition had a fatal flaw. Nikephoros, once her pawn, proved harder to control. As emperor, he grew increasingly devout, rejecting luxury, and some said Theophanos' affections. His austerity alienated the aristocracy, while his military campaigns drained the treasury. The very traits that made him a formidable general made him a disastrous partner in Theophanos' games. So she played her final card. In a plot worthy of the palace's darkest corners, Theophano allegedly conspired with her new lover Nikephoros' own nephew, John Tzimiskes, to stage a coup. On a freezing December night in 969, assassins climbed the palace walls using ropes, slipping into Nikephoros' chambers as he slept on the floor, as was his ascetic habit. They bludgeoned him to death with their sword hilts, then dragged his body through the streets like common loot. John took the throne, wedding Theophano in a shameless bid for legitimacy, until the church forced him to exile her for her crimes. The will that had launched Nikephoros' rise was now ashes, outlived by the woman who'd forged it. Theophanos' story wasn't just about betrayal, it revealed the Byzantine Court's cardinal rule: trust no one, not even your own handiwork. No general shone brighter in Byzantium's military annals than Belisarius, the man who reclaimed Rome for Justinian, who crushed Vandals in Africa and Goths in Italy. His victories should have earned him unshakable trust, yet in the corridors of power, loyalty was always a currency under suspicion. The cracks began after Belisarius's triumph in Italy. Rather than a hero's welcome, he returned to Constantinople in 541 to find his funds seized and his officers interrogated. Justinian's spies whispered that the general had lingered in Italy too long, perhaps eyeing the throne for himself. Never mind that Belisarius had sent every captured Gothic crown to the emperor. Suspicion, once planted, grew like a weed. 2 years later, the scandal exploded. A group of disgruntled officers caught plotting against Justinian swore under torture that Belisarius knew of their plans. No evidence ever surfaced, but the emperor's paranoia flared. In a humiliating spectacle, Belisarius was stripped of his command, his vast household guard disbanded, and his properties confiscated. For 8 months, the conqueror of nations languished under house arrest, a prisoner in the very empire he'd expanded. What makes this betrayal sting isn't just its injustice, but its irony. Belisarius had countless chances to seize power. When the Nika riots nearly toppled Justinian, it was Belisarius's troops who massacred the rebels. When the Goths offered him their crown, he refused. Yet none of this mattered when the court's whispers grew louder than facts. Justinian eventually relented, restoring Belisarius to command, but the damage was done. Every subsequent campaign was shadowed by imperial spies. Every victory was met with fresh scrutiny. The greatest mind in Byzantine military history spent his final years under a cloud, his loyalty forever questioned by the emperor he'd served without fail. Here lies the tragedy of Byzantium. Talent alone couldn't shield you from envy. Even the empire's brightest sword could be blunted by the softest whisper of doubt. The crown weighs heavy on a mother's head, especially when her own hands must break the one who should inherit it. Empress Irene of Athens knew this better than anyone. By the year 797, she had already spent a decade ruling as regent for her son Constantine VI, guiding the empire through iconoclasm and political storms. But as Constantine came of age, tensions between mother and son erupted into something far darker than mere rivalry. It began with whispers. Constantine, eager to rule alone, started sidelining Irene's advisors, even challenging her policies in open court. Then came the betrayals. When a rebellion backed by Irene briefly placed her back in power, Constantine retaliated by having her loyalists tortured and his own mother banished to a remote palace. But Irene was no ordinary dowager. She returned to court under the guise of reconciliation, biding her time while her son's arrogance alienated even his closest allies. The final act played out in the Purple Chamber, the very room where Constantine had been born. Soldiers loyal to Irene seized him mid-feast, dragging him before his mother as she pronounced his fate blinding. Byzantine custom held that mutilation, not death, was the punishment for usurpers, a living death that rendered one unfit to rule. The act itself was brutal, the tools crude. Some chroniclers claim the executioners botched the job, leaving Constantine to die of his wounds days later. Others insist Irene ensured he survived, a broken figure confined to the shadows while she claimed the throne as Basilius, not empress but emperor in her own right. History remembers Irene as the first woman to rule Byzantium alone, a master tactician who outmaneuvered generals and patriarchs alike. But her legacy is stained by the question no chronicle can fully answer. Was this ruthless seizure of power a mother's betrayal or a ruler's necessity? The empire she saved would ultimately betray her, deposing her within 5 years. Yet in that brief reign, Irene proved one unshakable truth in Byzantium: power had no room for mercy, not even for blood. Princess Anna Komnene never held a sword in battle, but her pen might have been the deadliest weapon in the empire. As the eldest daughter of Emperor Alexios I, she was raised expecting power, educated in philosophy, medicine, and statecraft, while her brother John grew up in the shadow of her brilliance. Then came the blow, her father's deathbed decree naming John, not Anna, as his heir. Overnight, the scholar princess found herself exiled from power, forced to watch as her younger brother took the throne in 1118. What happened next depends on whose account you believe. Anna's own masterpiece, the Alexiad, paints her as a devoted historian chronicling her father's reign with scholarly grace. But between its lines, courtiers whispered of a far darker narrative. Hidden passages allegedly described her gathering allies among disgruntled nobles, even plotting to poison John during a private dinner. The plan unraveled when a servant discovered a cache of letters Anna's own handwriting detailing which wines to lace with which toxins. John's response was glacial fury. Instead of executing his sister, he confined her to a monastery where she spent decades writing the very history that would immortalize her family and perhaps sanitize her own role in its bloodshed. The Alexiad became a literary triumph, a vivid chronicle of the First Crusade and Byzantine politics. Yet its omissions speak volumes. Anna lavishes praise on her father but barely mentions John's reign, reducing her brother's victories to footnotes. Was this scholarly bias or the revenge of a woman who'd been denied an empire? Modern historians still spar over the truth. Some argue the poison plot was John's pretext to sideline a rival. Others point to Anna's coded bitterness in passages describing the fragility of loyalty and the taste of betrayal. One thing is certain, in Byzantium, even the written word could be a dagger. Anna Comnene may have lost the throne, but through her writing, she ensured history would remember not just her brother's reign, but the sister who watched, waited, and never forgot. The candles flickered in the great church of Hagia Sophia as a hushed crowd gathered on Holy Saturday, 954. For centuries, the faithful had witnessed the miraculous descent of the holy fire, a divine flame said to ignite spontaneously on Christ's tomb in Jerusalem, then carried to Constantinople as proof of God's favor. But this year, the miracle reeked of something far more earthly: desperation. Patriarch Theophylact, a man better known for his love of horses than his piety, faced a crisis. Emperor Constantine VII was dying, and rival factions circled like vultures. The Patriarch needed a spectacle to unite the people, and what better than a divine sign endorsing his chosen successor? On the appointed night, as priests chanted and the masses held their breath, Theophylact's men staged their audacious fraud. Hidden compartments in the altar released pre-lit tapers, creating the illusion of heavenly fire. Gasps filled the cathedral as the flames miraculously spread, but the ruse unraveled almost immediately. A deacon, either bribed or guilt-ridden, confessed to the scheme, revealing how the Patriarch's artisans had crafted hollow candles filled with slow-burning chemicals. The scandal split the city. Had Theophylact blasphemed to manipulate the masses, or was this merely politics dressed in sacred robes? The fallout was swift and brutal. The Patriarch was forced to publicly repent, though his political allies ensured he kept his position. The real casualty was trust. Faith in the empire's spiritual authority never fully recovered. For centuries after, skeptics would whisper about the year God's fire burned a little too conveniently and a little too human. This wasn't just deception, it was a masterclass in Byzantine realpolitik. When divine favor couldn't be earned, it could be engineered, and in an empire where perception often outweighed truth, even miracles had their price. Emperor Michael III should have known better than to fall for his own protégé's charm. By the year 867, he'd ruled Byzantium for nearly his entire life, surviving early regencies and military coups. But his fatal weakness wasn't wine or arrogance, it was love. Not for a woman, but for the handsome, stable boy he plucked from obscurity, Basil the Macedonian. At first, their bond seemed mutually beneficial. Michael showered Basil with titles, even making him co-emperor, a shocking elevation for a man born a peasant. Courtiers whispered as Basil slept in the imperial chambers, dined from golden plates, and accompanied Michael everywhere like a shadow. But behind the devotion lurked darker calculations. Basil, it turned out, had ambitions far beyond being a favorite. The breaking point came when Michael, ever capricious, began favoring a new companion, a charioteer named Basiliskianos. Overnight, the emperor's affections shifted, and the Macedonian found himself sidelined. A lesser man might have accepted his fall from grace, not Basil. On the night of September 24, 867, as Michael feasted in his country palace, assassins burst into the room. The emperor barely had time to cry out before blades found their mark. The killers, Basil's own brothers, the mastermind, the man Michael had lifted from the stables to the throne itself. Basil's next move was pure political theater. He declared himself sole emperor, framing the murder as a tragic necessity to save the empire from Michael's excesses. The aristocracy, long weary of Michael's erratic rule, acquiesced. And just like that, the Macedonian dynasty was born, not through bloodline but betrayal. Here's the cruel irony: Basil would go on to become one of Byzantium's greatest rulers, expanding the empire and stabilizing its finances. The very man who murdered his way to power proved ruthlessly competent with it. Their story wasn't just a cautionary tale about trust, it revealed Byzantium's brutal meritocracy. Talent could rise from anywhere, even the stables, and sometimes the deadliest threats weren't foreign armies, but the hands you'd clasped closest to your own heart. In the dim glow of candlelit chapels, Byzantine emperors didn't just collect gold, they amassed something far more potent, relics believed to crackle with divine power. And no relic was more coveted than the remains of John the Baptist, the prophet who'd baptized Christ himself. By the 6th century, Antioch proudly guarded his skull in a silver reliquary, until Justinian's agents decided it belonged in Constantinople. The operation unfolded like a thieves' guild's masterpiece. Disguised as pilgrims, imperial envoys bribed guards, swapped the sacred skull with a counterfeit, and smuggled it aboard a ship bound for the capital. When Antioch's faithful discovered the theft, riots erupted. Churches burned, mobs accused the emperor of sacrilege, shouting that God would punish Byzantium for this sin. And then uncannily the empire's luck turned. Plague ravaged Constantinople, earthquakes shattered its walls. Even Justinian's grandest projects like Hagia Sophia faced mysterious construction delays. Superstitious whispers spread. This was divine retribution for stealing a saint's bones. Desperate to appease heaven, Justinian ordered lavish processions displaying the relic, as if flaunting it could sanctify the theft. But the damage was done. Here's the twist: the skull's presence didn't calm the empire's storms, it magnified them. Rival bishops claimed their cities held the real relic, sparking theological feuds that outlasted emperors. The scandal exposed Byzantium's obsession with sacred objects as political tools. A stolen skull could legitimize a ruler or condemn him. For all its gold and glory, even an empire trembled when it gambled with the divine. The Imperial Court buzzed with nobles flaunting their power, but none saw the silent figures weaving through their midst. Castrated not just in body but in society's regard, eunuchs were dismissed as harmless attendants. Empress Theodora recognized their invisibility was the ultimate weapon. With a flick of her jeweled fingers, she turned these overlooked men into the deadliest spy network Byzantium had ever known. Trained in the art of discretion, Theodora's eunuch agents blended into palace routines, pouring wine at banquets, tending to chamber pots, even delivering love letters between adulterous aristocrats. Their ears caught every drunken boast, their eyes recorded every midnight rendezvous. Theodora's genius lay in her understanding of human nature. People rarely guard their tongues around those they consider beneath notice. The system ran like a well-oiled machine. Each week, her chief eunuch, Narses, delivered scrolls of meticulously gathered secrets who owed gambling debts to Persian merchants, which general frequented brothels, even which bishops had bastard children. Theodora didn't just collect dirt, she weaponized it. A strategically leaked rumor here, a veiled reference at a state dinner there, and suddenly opposition to her policies melted away. When a senator dared criticize her influence over Justinian, she privately mentioned his daughter's affair with a gladiator. The speech he'd prepared for the Senate mysteriously vanished. But Theodora's network wasn't just about threats. She rewarded loyalty as fiercely as she punished defiance. Eunuchs who excelled received estates, titles, even command of military campaigns. Narses himself would later crush the Goths in Italy. This was the Empress's masterstroke. She gave her spies a stake in the empire's survival. modern historians still debate the ethics of her methods, yet none deny their effectiveness. In a realm where power balanced on knife's edge, Theodora proved information wasn't just valuable, it was the ultimate currency. And in Byzantium, the quietest hands often held the sharpest daggers. To outsiders, Princess Zoe Porphyrogenita seemed blessed by fate, born in the purple chamber reserved for imperial births. Her veins flowed with dynastic legitimacy no usurper could match. Yet by her 40th year, this royal jewel found herself trapped in gilded isolation, her father having barred her from marriage to prevent rivals. But when Emperor Constantine VIII lay dying in 1028, Zoe's bloodline became her weapon. Her first move was swift. With her father's last breath, 50-year-old Zoe secured the throne by wedding Romanos III, an aging aristocrat handpicked by the court. Romanos got an empire, Zoe got a puppet. For 3 years she ruled through him, until his sudden demise after a suspiciously hearty feast. The whispers began before his body cooled. Had Zoe's famed alchemical experiments yielded more than perfumes? Enter Michael IV, Zoe's second husband, a dashing young bodyguard she elevated from obscurity. This time, passion overrode strategy. Blind to Michael's manipulations, Zoe didn't notice as he sidelined her, appointing his own family to key positions. When illness left Michael a shell of himself, Zoe nursed him tenderly until his relatives forced her to adopt their nephew as heir. The moment Michael died, they exiled her to a convent, betting the empire wouldn't miss a lovesick widow. They underestimated the purple-born princess. Zoe stormed back, deposing her adopted heir in a single night by flashing her birthright before the people. Then came her final, fatal miscalculation, recalling her sister Theodora from exile as co-empress. The quiet, pious sibling Zoe had dismissed as no threat soon proved otherwise. Theodora's administrative genius outshone Zoe's theatrics, turning the court against her. Zoe's third marriage to Constantine Monomachos was pure desperation, a last bid for relevance. But the throne already had its true ruler, Theodora, who'd learned from her sister's mistakes. When Zoe died in 1050, Byzantium mourned its glamorous princess while Theodora, the forgotten sister, prepared to govern alone. Their story wasn't just about sibling rivalry, it revealed Byzantium's brutal truth. Even royal blood couldn't protect you from the apprentice who'd been watching your every move. The palace lay silent under a moonless sky as Emperor Nikephoros Phocas knelt on the stone floor of his bedchamber, not in prayer, but in his nightly ritual of sleeping like a common soldier. The austerity that once endeared him to the people now made him vulnerable. No guards stood watch, no weapons lay within reach. Only the faint clink of ropes scraping against marble betrayed the assassins scaling the palace walls. Among them moved John Tzimisk's, Nikephoros' own nephew and protege. The general who had fought beside him in countless battles now led a band of conspirators handpicked by Theophono, the empress whose love had curdled into loathing. She'd promised John the throne. All he had to do was remove the man who'd raised him from obscurity. Nikephoros awoke to shadows looming over him. Legend claims his last words weren't a plea for mercy, but a bitter laugh. God, grant me vengeance. As the first blow landed, the assassins used their sword hilts instead of blades, not out of mercy, but to prolong the horror. By dawn, the emperor's mutilated body was dragged through the streets, his face unrecognizable. Theophono's triumph was short-lived. Though John seized the throne, the church forced him to exile her for the crime she'd orchestrated. The murder that began as a lover's plot ended as a cautionary tale. In Byzantium, even the most carefully laid schemes could unravel with a single act of brutality. And sometimes the dead had the last word. The Byzantine throne had survived countless betrayals, but by the late 10th century, Emperor Basil II faced a crisis no amount of purges could solve. His own generals, aristocrats with private armies, kept plotting against him, their loyalty as fickle as the wind. Then Basil made a decision that would reshape the empire's destiny. he turned to the north, where axe-wielding Vikings were forging legends of their own. These weren't just any mercenaries. The Varangians, as the Byzantines called them, were Norse warriors whose code of honor revolved around absolute fidelity to their paymaster. Unlike local troops entangled in court politics, these towering foreigners had no ties to Byzantine factions. Their allegiance was brutally simple: gold for service, death for betrayal. Basil saw their potential instantly. In 988, after aiding him in crushing a rebellion, 6,000 Varangians entered Constantinople not as invaders, but as the emperor's new personal guard. The arrangement was revolutionary. While Byzantine nobles schemed in marble halls, the Varangians stood vigil with dragon-painted shields, their presence a silent warning. Their axes struck down conspirators without hesitation, even when the accused were high-born generals. One chronicler describes a nobleman begging for mercy in fluent Norse, having grown up trading with Vikings. The Varangian captain merely shrugged and swung his blade, replying, "The emperor's silver speaks louder than your mother tongue." But Basil's genius wasn't just in hiring bodyguards. He institutionalized the Varangians, giving them land, legal privileges, and even roles in ceremonial processions. Over time, they became a symbol of imperial might, so feared that future emperors kept them long after Basil's death. When Byzantine factions fought for control, both sides knew the throne truly belonged to whoever held the loyalty of the axe-bearers. This wasn't just a military reform, it was a masterstroke of political survival. By outsourcing his protection to outsiders, Basil created a power base untouchable by domestic intrigue. The Varangians would guard emperors for centuries, their saga intertwined with Byzantium's own, proof that sometimes the strongest shields are forged far from home. Constantine VIII's death in 1028 should have been the end of an era, but instead, it lit the fuse for one of Byzantium's strangest succession crises. The emperor left only his daughters, Zoe and Theodora, as heirs. Yet for years, whispers had swirled about a third child, a son allegedly born in secret, spirited away to prevent the empire from fracturing over his claim. Most dismissed it as tavern gossip until a man arrived in Constantinople claiming to be that very prince. He called himself Romanos, and his story was eerily plausible. Born to a noblewoman said to be Constantine's secret lover, he'd been raised in obscurity by loyalists who feared the boy would be murdered if his lineage became known. Now, with the throne in dispute, he emerged bearing supposed proof: a signet ring, a lock of the late emperor's hair, even a childhood tutor who swore under oath. The timing was impeccable. Zoe's tumultuous marriages had left the aristocracy restless, and many leapt at the chance to rally behind a male heir. What followed wasn't just a rebellion, it was a spectacle of political theater. Romanos' supporters staged public readings of forged imperial letters, while Zoe's faction spread lurid tales of his origins as a butcher's son. The truth hardly mattered. In the chaos, provinces declared for the pretender, minting coins with his likeness. Mercenary armies mobilized not out of loyalty, but because civil war meant profit. Then, as suddenly as he'd appeared, Romanos vanished. Some said Zoe's agents ambushed his ship, others that his own allies betrayed him when his funds ran dry. The only certainty, his brief, fiery rise exposed Byzantium's deepest vulnerability. An empire built on bloodlines could be undone by the mere shadow of one. The phantom heir left no grave, no descendants, just a haunting question. What if he'd been telling the truth? For decades after, pretenders would invoke his name, proving that in Byzantium, even ghosts could wear the purple. The air inside the great palace hung thick with roasted meats and sweet wines, but not a single guest dared lift a fork. Emperor Andronikos Komnenos leaned back on his couch, watching with a predator's grin as his nobles shifted uncomfortably on their cushions. This was no ordinary banquet. The year was 1185, and the emperor had just crushed a rebellion. Now he'd invited the conspirators' families to dine on their own kin. Earlier that week, captured rebels had been executed in the palace courtyards, not by sword or rope, but by the butcher's blade. Their remains were salted, spiced, and roasted alongside pheasants and lambs, the charred flesh indistinguishable to the untrained eye. Only when the feasting began did Andronikos reveal the horror. A servant presented the head of one noble son on a silver platter, the face still recognizable beneath the glaze. "Why waste good meat?" the emperor quipped as retching guests fled the hall. This wasn't just cruelty, it was psychological warfare. Andronikos, once a dashing prince exiled for years, had returned to power through bloodshed, and he understood terror better than statecraft. By forcing fathers to unknowingly taste their children's flesh, he didn't just punish treason, he shattered the aristocracy's will to resist. The aftermath revealed the true genius of his brutality. Survivors spread tales of the Black Banquet so voraciously that provincial governors surrendered without a fight. Even enemies abroad hesitated to exploit Byzantium's instability, fearing a ruler who defied all norms of mercy. Yet Andronikos's reign would crumble within months, his own body torn apart by a mob. The lesson was clear: in Byzantium, fear could win a throne, but only humanity could keep it. Heroes of Byzantium rarely faded quietly into history, especially not an emperor like Heraclius, who dragged the empire back from the brink of annihilation. After decades of war, he'd shattered Persia's might, reclaimed Jerusalem's stolen relics, and even reformed the crumbling military. Yet when death came for him in 641, his body vanished without the grand mausoleum his deeds deserved. The man who saved Byzantium was buried in obscurity, his resting place scrubbed from official records. At first, the whispers seemed like mere superstition. Servants swore they saw a spectral figure in old-fashioned armor pacing the palace corridors, his face twisted in sorrow. Later emperors claimed to hear disembodied sighs near the chapel of St. Stephen, where Heraclius had often prayed, but the stories grew darker. Some courtiers insisted the ghost's appearance foreshadowed disaster, a Persian ambush, a plague outbreak, even the sudden death of an heir. The truth behind the secrecy was as political as it was eerie. Heraclius's final years had been marred by tragedy, his wife accused of witchcraft, his sons dying in a web of suspicion, the empire losing Syria and Egypt to the relentless Arab advance. Burying him quietly wasn't just about humility, it was damage control. A grand tomb would have drawn pilgrims and inconvenient questions about how Byzantium's golden age had crumbled so fast. Yet history has its own justice. Today, archaeologists hunt for Heraclius's lost grave, while scholars debate whether the ghost tales were propaganda, a way for later rulers to invoke his legacy or explain their failures. One chilling detail persists. The last emperor before Constantinople's fall in 1453 reported seeing a weeping figure in ancient regalia the night the Ottomans breached the walls. If true, perhaps Heraclius's spirit didn't haunt the palace out of anger but grief, watching helplessly as the empire he'd saved began its long, slow collapse. Some legacies refused to rest. Even in death, Byzantium's greatest champion became a warning. No victory is eternal, and no tomb can silence the past. The imperial bedchamber should have been a sanctuary for newlyweds, especially when the bride wore purple and the groom the imperial diadem. But when Zoe Porphyrogenita married Romanos III in 1028, their union became anything but sacred. It was less a marriage than a carefully staged political alliance, binding Romanos to the Macedonian dynasty through Zoe's royal blood. Yet behind the silk curtains and whispered vows, their private life was a tinderbox of humiliation and rage. Romanos, a bureaucrat thrust onto the throne by circumstance, faced impossible expectations. Not only did he need to rule an empire, he had to produce an heir with a wife decades his junior. But from the first night, the marriage crumbled under a scandal whispered in palace corridors: the emperor's impotence. Chronicles describe Zoe's growing fury as months turned to years without consummation, her legendary temper flaring at the slightest provocation. Romanos, desperate to save face, turned to physicians and mystics, even ordering public prayers for his virility, a humiliation that only deepened the court's snickering. Enter Michael IV, a golden-voiced palace servant with shoulders broad enough to carry both Zoe's frustrations and her ambitions. Their affair wasn't just reckless passion, it was a calculated risk. Zoe, still the empire's true power, knew Romanos' reign teetered on his ability to father a child. And when the emperor suddenly took ill after bathing in the imperial pools in 1034, few believed the official story of a tragic drowning. A court physician noted Romanos' face bore the telltale bluish tint of strangulation, and servants swore they'd seen Michael's brothers lurking near the bath. Yet the most damning evidence came from Zoe herself. Within weeks of Romanos' death, she wed Michael in a ceremony so rushed the patriarch barely had time to bless the union. The message was unmistakable. This wasn't just a widow's grief, it was a coup in silk slippers. Byzantine law forbade an empress from ruling alone, but Zoe had found her loophole: marry the right man, and the throne remained hers in all but name. Romanos' fate exposes Byzantium's ruthless marital politics. A failed marriage wasn't just personal, it was existential. And in this world of poisoned chalices and staged accidents, even an emperor's bed could become a battlefield. Flames licked the night sky over Constantinople in the year 1118, casting an unholy glow on the faces of the gathered crowd. At the center of the pyre stood Basil the Bogomil, a man whose teachings had unraveled the very fabric of Byzantine orthodoxy. His crime, leading a sect that rejected the church's wealth, its icons, even the sacraments, preaching that true faith required no priests, no grand cathedrals, only the purity of the soul. To Emperor Alexios Komnenos, such ideas weren't just heresy, they were a threat to the empire's divine order. The execution was meant to be a spectacle, a warning to would-be dissenters. As the fire roared, Basil's final words reportedly rang out, "You burn one man, but my faith is written on 1,000 hearts." The crowd fell silent. Even the patriarch shifted uneasily, because the truth was Bogomilism had already seeped into the empire's cracks, spread by peasants who chafed under church taxes, by nobles drawn to its egalitarian ideals, even by soldiers who carried its whispers to the frontiers. Alexios had miscalculated. Rather than extinguishing the heresy, Basil's martyrdom fueled it. Underground networks smuggled Bogomil texts disguised as hymnals. Farmers held secret midnight gatherings in vineyards, their prayers stripped of ritual, their Bibles were written in plain language. The empire's response grew increasingly desperate: mass arrests, public humiliations, even the blinding of suspected adherents. Yet the harder Byzantium pressed, the deeper the movement rooted itself, flaring up in Bulgaria, spreading to Bosnia, even reaching the distant valleys of France, where it would later morph into the Cathar heresy. This wasn't just a religious crackdown, it was a battle for the empire's soul. Byzantium had survived barbarians and caliphs, but Basil's quiet revolution posed a more insidious danger. What if the people no longer needed emperors or bishops to reach God? The flames that consumed him lit a fire that would smolder for centuries, proving that ideas, once kindled, are far harder to extinguish than flesh. From the gutters of Constantinople's brothels to the golden halls of the great palace, few rises to power were as scandalous or as shrouded in rumor as Theodora's. Ancient chroniclers like Procopius claimed the future empress didn't just work in the city's pleasure districts. She allegedly ran them, orchestrating a web of seduction and blackmail that ensnared the empire's elite. But how much of this salacious tale was truth, and how much was political slander? Theodora's early life is well documented as an actress, a profession tied to the theater's seedier side, where performances blurred with paid companionship. Procopius paints lurid scenes of her hosting lavish parties for senators, using the encounters to gather compromising secrets. Yet his infamous secret history reads more like a hit piece than sober fact, written after Theodora's death when Justinian's reign faced backlash. Modern historians note striking omissions. No contemporary sources mention a brothel, and Theodora's fiercest enemies never used it against her while she lived. What's undeniable is her mastery of leverage. Whether through pillow talk or patronage, Theodora cultivated allies in every corner of the court. As empress, she passed laws banning forced prostitution and granting women greater divorce rights reforms that suggest personal empathy, not just calculated image building. The brothel rumors may have been a weaponized fiction, but one that reveals Byzantium's double standard. A man's past exploits were overlooked, while a woman's became ammunition. Theodora's true genius wasn't in running a brothel, it was in rewriting her own story. From the moment she met Justinian, she meticulously refashioned herself into a pious co-ruler, her theatrical flair now channeled into imperial ceremony. The whispers never fully faded, but they couldn't drown out her legacy. In the end, the most shocking thing wasn't the rumors, it was how thoroughly a woman of ill repute outmaneuvered the men who sneered at her. The Bulgarian snows still bore the scars of battle when the search began, not for bodies, but for a treasure that vanished as swiftly as the breath of the dying. Emperor Nikephoros I had marched into those mountains in 811 with the imperial treasury in tow, a fortune meant to fund his campaign against the Bulgar Khan Krum. Then came the ambush. The slaughter was so complete that Krum reportedly had Nikephoros' skull lined with silver, turning it into a drinking cup. But when Byzantine envoys later sought to recover the emperor's remains, they discovered something far more unsettling. The gold was gone. Not lost in battle, not seized by the Bulgars, simply disappeared. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some claimed Nikephoros' own ministers had orchestrated the theft, using the chaos of his death to spirit away chests of coins under cover of night. Others whispered of a renegade general who diverted the gold mid-march, stashing it in monasteries along the route. The most damning theory, that the funds never reached the battlefield at all, that corrupt officials had been siphoning them for years, leaving Nikephoros to fight with an empty war chest. What makes this mystery so compelling isn't just the scale of the theft, enough gold to pay an army for a decade, but the audacity of its execution. These weren't common thieves. They were men who dined at the emperor's table, men who knew exactly how to exploit bureaucracy to cover their tracks. Scrolls were misplaced, witnesses conveniently died. And when investigators pressed too hard, they found themselves reassigned to distant provinces. Krum's victory had shattered Byzantine morale, but the missing treasury broke something deeper: trust. Future emperors would split their treasuries into smaller, scattered caches, no longer daring to risk it all in one place. The gold itself might have melted away, but its ghost haunted imperial policy for centuries. Perhaps the real crime wasn't the theft, it was how easily the empire's guardians became its gravediggers. The streets of Adrianople buzzed with whispers in the year 1205. A humble monk stood before a growing crowd, his ragged robes unable to conceal his startling resemblance to a vanished ruler. The deposed Emperor Alexios III, who'd fled Constantinople after his nephew's coup. At first, the monk's claims seemed like madness, but as he spoke mimicking Alexios's distinctive lisp, recalling palace secrets only an insider would know, even skeptics began to wonder. Had the fallen emperor truly returned as a penitent holy man, ready to reclaim his throne with divine backing? Rebel forces clinging to the old regime's remnants flocked to him, their desperation outweighing suspicion. Local officials hesitated, terrified of executing a potential monarch. The impostor's confidence grew with each passing day, until a former palace chef, now running a tavern near the monastery, noticed something off. The man claiming to be Alexios devoured pork with gusto, while the real emperor had famously abstained for religious reasons. The revelation unraveled like a poorly woven shroud. Under torture, the monk confessed he was a runaway slave named Nicholas who'd served as a palace stable boy, memorizing Alexios's mannerisms during years of observation. His plan not to seize power but to manipulate it, extorting regional governors for imperial pardons before vanishing with the gold. What makes this charade chilling isn't just its audacity, but how close it came to working. Byzantium's legitimacy was so entwined with symbols, a face, a name, a familiar gesture, that even an obvious fraud could ignite rebellions. The would-be emperor met his end in a dank prison cell, but his ruse exposed a deeper truth. In a crumbling empire, perception often outweighed reality. And sometimes all it took to shake a throne was the right lie, told at the right time by the right face. The golden domes of Constantinople glittered under the summer sun as Princess Anna Porphyrogenita prepared for a journey that would change the course of history. Born into the imperial purple, she was no ordinary bride. She was Byzantium's sharpest diplomatic weapon. Her destination, the rugged lands of the Kievan Rus, ruled by the formidable Prince Vladimir. What unfolded next wasn't just a royal wedding, it was an empire's masterclass in religious conquest by other means. Vladimir had spent years weighing his options. Pagan gods had unified his people, but neighboring powers, Christian Byzantium and Islamic Volga Bulgaria, saw his soul as geopolitical leverage. Emissaries arrived with competing offers. The Bulgars promised trade, the Germans military aid. But the Byzantines played a longer game. They didn't just send diplomats, they staged an encounter that would become legend. As Vladimir's envoys entered Hagia Sophia, hidden choirs began to chant, their voices swelling beneath the dome's celestial mosaics. Incense swirled as priests swung golden censers, sunlight refracting through the smoke like divine intervention. The Rus emissaries later confessed they knew not whether they were in heaven or on earth. This theatrical display wasn't accidental, it was psychological warfare designed to overwhelm the senses. Yet the real stroke of genius came with the marriage treaty. Anna wouldn't merely cement an alliance, her dowry demanded Vladimir's baptism, binding his conversion to political legitimacy. The prince agreed, but only after securing the unthinkable. A Byzantine princess had never before been given to a barbarian ruler. For Vladimir, this wasn't just a wife, it was a bloodline's validation. The baptism itself was a spectacle of calculated symbolism. Byzantine chroniclers describe Vladimir emerging from the waters of Chersonesus with a new name, Basil, honoring his imperial brother-in-law and an army of Byzantine missionaries. The Rus conversion wasn't a spiritual awakening, it was a geopolitical coup. Churches rose where pagan idols once stood, their liturgy using Slavonic instead of Greek, a concession that ensured the faith would stick. Behind the hagiographies lies a colder truth. Byzantium didn't just spread Christianity, it weaponized it. Vladimir's baptism secured a buffer state against steppe nomads, a trading partner for silks and silver, and a people forever tethered to Constantinople's cultural orbit. The miracle wasn't divine, it was diplomatic, and in the flicker of baptismal candles, an empire had rewritten a nation's destiny. The moon hung low over Constantinople's Theodosian walls on the night the empire almost fell, not to battering rams or catapults, but to treachery from within. It was the winter of 821, and while the city slept, a faction of disillusioned iconoclasts moved like shadows through its streets. These weren't just dissenters, they were soldiers, bureaucrats, even priests who'd grown bitter after Empress Irene's restoration of holy icons. Now, with the throne weakened by succession struggles, they saw their chance to strike a deal with the empire's greatest enemy, the Bulgar Khan Krum. Their plan was as simple as it was deadly. At midnight, a cotter of conspirators would disable the guards at the Corinthian gate, then signal Krum's forces waiting in the darkness beyond. The Bulgar horde would flood into the city before dawn, toppling the regime in a single stroke. But history has a way of pivoting on the smallest of moments, in this case, a guard named Leo who'd been deemed too drunk to notice the plot. As the conspirators gathered near the gatehouse, Leo stumbled from a tavern, his ears catching snippets of their hushed conversation. The alcohol might have blurred his vision, but it sharpened his instincts. Slurring an excuse about fetching more wine, he lurched toward the nearest barracks, rousing his captain with a single slurred warning: "They're selling the gate." What followed wasn't a battle, but a hunt. The Imperial Guard descended on the conspirators with silent efficiency, arresting over 300 men before they could light the signal fire. Interrogations revealed the staggering scope of the plot. High-ranking officers had mapped patrol routes for the Bulgars, while scribes forged orders to clear key streets. The emperor's response was swift and brutal. Executions filled the hippodrome for weeks, their bodies left as warnings, yet the real lesson lay in the aftermath. Constantinople's walls had held against armies for centuries, but this siege required no ladders, only a whisper. The empire's greatest weakness wasn't its stones, but the hearts of those sworn to defend them. And sometimes salvation wore the face of a drunkard who happened to listen at the right moment. The imperial archives hold no record of their deaths, only whispers of parchment that carried poison not in their words but in their very fibers. Emperor Leo VI ruled Byzantium with a scholar's mind and a reformer's zeal, yet his personal life was shadowed by tragedy. 3 wives perished under suspicious circumstances, each following the same eerie pattern: a summons to the private scriptorium, a ceremonial signing of an imperial decree, and then silence. The court physicians called it fever. The servants knew better. The method was as ingenious as it was cruel. Documents meant for the empress's seal were allegedly brushed with a slow-acting toxin, perhaps arsenic mixed into the ink, or poison distilled from Mediterranean herbs and pressed into the parchment. As the royal fingers traced the letters, the poison seeped into their skin, its effects delayed just long enough to avoid suspicion. By nightfall, the pain would begin: cramps, dizziness, then a sleep from which none awoke. Leo's enemies claimed he orchestrated the deaths to clear the way for his controversial 4th marriage to Zoe Carbonopsina, a union the church fiercely opposed. Others pointed to his advisors, who may have seen the empresses as obstacles to their influence. The most chilling theory: the documents weren't meant to kill at all, but to intimidate, a miscalculation that turned fatal when the doses proved too strong. What makes this intrigue so unsettling isn't just the method, but the symbolism. In an empire where the written word held divine authority, turning sacred decrees into weapons perverted the very foundation of Byzantine power. Even today, historians debate whether the poisoned ink was fact or slander, but the stain on Leo's legacy remains. For in Byzantium, the deadliest lies weren't always spoken, sometimes they were signed in imperial purple. The plains of Anatolia stretched empty under a moonless sky, or so the Seljuk scouts believed. Emperor Manuel Komnenos had spent weeks retreating from their forces, his army seemingly dwindling with each passing day. But as the Turkish commanders prepared their final assault in 1176, they failed to notice the strange patterns in the abandoned camps, the soldiers who never moved from their posts, the campfires that burned too uniformly. By the time they realized the truth, Manuel's real forces had already circled behind them. This was no ordinary ruse, it was psychological warfare perfected. Byzantine artisans had crafted hundreds of straw-stuffed dummies, dressing them in spare armor and propping them on poles to cast silhouettes against the horizon. Each night, servants lit identical clusters of fires in precise formations, mimicking the layout of a real legion's camp. To the distant observers, it appeared Manuel's forces were digging in rather than slipping away. The genius lay in the details. Some dummies wore officers' plumes, others were posed mid-task sharpening invisible swords, stirring phantom stew pots. The emperor even staged fake deserters, sending actors into Seljuk territory with carefully leaked plans of the army's fictional positions. When the Turks finally attacked the decoy camp, they found only smoldering embers and straw men, and Manuel's cavalry thundering down from the hills they'd thought unguarded. Crusader kings later borrowed these tactics, but none matched Byzantium's artistry. What Manuel understood wasn't just deception, it was theater. Every dummy, every staged whisper fed the enemy's assumptions until they chased shadows straight into a slaughter. In an empire where perception shaped reality, sometimes the deadliest soldiers were the ones who never drew breath at all. The golden nose of Justinian II wasn't just a prosthetic, it was a political statement forged in blood and vengeance. After a brutal coup in 695 left the emperor mutilated, his severed nose became the ultimate humiliation, a mark meant to disqualify him from ever ruling again. Byzantine tradition held that physical imperfection barred one from the throne, but Justinian refused to fade into exile. Instead, he commissioned a replacement, pure gold, sculpted to perfection, a gleaming defiance of his enemy's cruelty. His path back to power reads like a thriller. First, he fled to the Khazars, marrying a Kogan sister to secure allies. Then, when his new in-laws wavered, he slipped away again, this time to Bulgaria. All the while, that golden nose became his rallying cry, proof that his claim hadn't died with his flesh. Supporters whispered it was a divine sign, a heavenly endorsement of his rightful rule. By 705, he'd amassed an army of Bulgars and Slavs, storming Constantinople through an overlooked aqueduct to reclaim his throne. The irony. Justinian's vengeance turned him into the very monster his enemies feared. Once restored, he executed the usurpers who'd mutilated him, some by drowning, others burned alive. Even his former Khazar allies weren't spared when they demanded his wife's return. But the nose, that symbol of resilience, vanished during his final overthrow in 711. Some say it was melted down as war loot, others insist it was buried with him, a final middle finger to the world that tried to break him. Either way, its legacy endured. For centuries after, pretenders to the Byzantine throne would cite Justinian's golden nose as precedent proof that no wound, no mutilation could erase the will to power. In a realm where perception was everything, sometimes all it took to rewrite fate was a single, audacious lie in shining metal. The convent walls held more than prayers. They concealed a royal secret that would rattle the Byzantine throne for generations. Emperor Constantine V, known as the fiercest iconoclast in imperial history, spent his reign tearing down sacred images, yet he couldn't erase the whispered rumors about his own flesh and blood. While official records listed only sons, whispers spoke of a daughter hidden away in a secluded monastery to ensure her brother's unchallenged succession. The scandal wasn't merely about illegitimacy. Byzantine law recognized daughters as potential heirs, especially in the absence of male successors. But Constantine, paranoid about factionalism, reportedly saw his daughter as a liability, a pawn future rivals could marry to claim the throne. Some chroniclers claim she was spirited away at birth, given the name Anthausa, and raised in pious obscurity. Others suggest she was the product of a union so politically toxic, perhaps with an exiled iconophile noblewoman, that her very existence threatened the emperor's religious reforms. For decades, the rumor smoldered until the Macedonian dynasty's rise in the 9th century, when a mysterious nun named Anthausa began receiving visitors from the Imperial Court. She was said to possess an uncanny knowledge of palace intrigues and even intervened in theological disputes with startling authority. Later historians noted that Emperor Basil I, a usurper with no blood claim, took unusual interest in her counsel, leading some to speculate he was legitimizing his rule through her whispered endorsement. The truth may never be fully unraveled, but the legacy of this shadow princess reveals a brutal calculus. In Byzantium, even family ties could be threats to be managed, and sometimes the safest place for royalty wasn't a palace but a cloister's silent shadows. What began as one emperor's cautionary act became a ghost haunting every succession crisis that followed. The library of Constantinople's imperial physicians was no ordinary collection. It held scrolls on poisons disguised as remedies, treatises on battlefield surgery, and one notorious manuscript bound in human skin. Known only as the Codex Basilicos, this forbidden text was penned by Basil the physician, a man whose medical brilliance was matched only by his lethal discretion. Court records list him as a trusted healer to emperors, but between the lines of his cryptic writings lay something far darker: recipes for imperial murders masquerading as medicine. Take his infamous treatment for melancholy, a tonic supposedly blending honey, wine, and crushed pearls. The ingredients seemed lavish, fit for an emperor's malaise. But later scholars noted a chilling detail. The pearls were actually ground cherry pits, laced with enough cyanide to kill within hours. Another page prescribed dragon's blood salve for skin lesions, a concoction containing realgar arsenic that would seep through the skin over weeks. The genius of Basil's methods wasn't just their effectiveness, it was their deniability. Each deadly dose could be passed off as a tragic misdiagnosis. Legend claims the book's final pages held his masterwork, a poison mimicking slow fever, its symptoms indistinguishable from natural illness. When Emperor Romanos III succumbed to a mysterious wasting sickness in 1034, the court physician noted his decline matched Basil's descriptions perfectly. By then, the doctor himself had vanished, likely at the hands of a client, ensuring his silence. What makes this codex so unsettling isn't just its contents, but its afterlife. Centuries later, Venetian spies stole a copy during the sack of Constantinople, believing it held alchemical secrets. They got something far more valuable, a blueprint for politically convenient deaths. Today, scattered pages survive under lock and key, testament to an empire where healing and killing shared the same scalpel's edge. The candlelight guttered in the scholar's chamber as Michael Sellos drew his last labored breath. Once the brightest mind of Byzantium, tutor to emperors, confidant to patriarchs, he now lay withered on his cot, surrounded by students clutching ink-stained parchment. What poured from his lips wasn't a prayer, but a prophecy so precise it chilled the bones of those who heard it. "Beware the Franks bearing crosses," he rasped. "They will enter through the walls we neglected, while our own princes squabble over gilded crumbs." Then, as if sealing the empire's fate himself, the great logothete of the court fell silent forever. History remembers Sellos as a polymath, a philosopher who debated with emperors, a scientist who dissected the stars, but his final warning was dismissed as the ramblings of a dying man. After all, the empire had weathered crises before. What were a few barbarian knights compared to the Persians, the Arabs, the Bulgars? Yet Sellos hadn't predicted mere invasion. He'd foreseen betrayal from within. Decades later, his words unfolded with eerie precision. As the Crusaders camped outside Constantinople in 1204, Emperor Alexios IV was too busy bribing them to notice his own cousin plotting a coup. The city's fabled walls, long undermanned due to court graft, crumbled under a single determined assault. And when the Latin knights finally surged through, they didn't come as conquerors. They came as liberators, waving sacred banners while gutting the very civilization they'd sworn to protect. The richest irony, Sellos's prophecy survived in a single manuscript, buried in a monastery until scholars rediscovered it centuries later. By then, the lesson was clear: empires don't fall by accident. They're dismantled first by arrogance, then by blindness, and finally by those who mistake destruction for salvation. In the end, even the wisest counsel is worthless if the throne refuses to listen. From poisoned parchments to phantom heirs, the Byzantine Empire turned survival into a twisted art form. These weren't just palace dramas, they were the gears that turned history. Theodora's spy network rewrote the rules of power. Basil II's mass blindings became a warning carved into flesh. And let's not forget the golden nose that mocked an emperor's mutilation, proof that even broken men could shatter a throne. What's chilling isn't just the brutality, it's the brilliance. Every plot, every betrayal exposed the dark genius of a system where loyalty was currency and trust was suicide. These intrigues didn't just topple emperors, they shaped laws, redirected wars, and forged an empire that lasted 1,000 years despite, or perhaps because of its cutthroat politics. So which mystery lingers in your mind, the staged miracles of Hagia Sophia, the princess who wielded alchemy as a weapon, or the banquet where guests dined on their own kin? Drop your pick in the comments. We love geeking out over history's darkest corners. And if you're hungry for more deep dives into the shadows of the past, hit that subscribe button. Trust us, you haven't seen the half of it. History isn't just about dates and battles. It's about the whispers that change the world. Thanks for joining us in the labyrinth. Until next time, keep questioning, because the past always has secrets left to spill.